streets, with some areas now being placed under curfew from 6 p.m. to 7 a.m. local time. Across the country, tens of thousands of protesters clashed with police after Friday prayers. Medical sources are reporting at least 5 people have been killed and hundreds others injured in Cairo alone. President Hosni Mubarak, who's facing the biggest challenge to his authority of his 31 years in power, has ordered the army onto the streets. Internet access and mobile phone networks have been shut down in a number of areas. But the military's presence seems to have so far failed to deter protesters. Flames have been seen from the area around the headquarters of the governing National Democratic Party in Cairo. Protesters apparently have also surrounded the state TV building along with the foreign ministry.
Nightfall in Cairo and the ruling party's headquarters burn. President Mubarak extended an overnight curfew to cover large parts of the country on Friday. Hours after it officially came into place, protesters tried to storm the state television building. They were later dispersed by the army, which has been deployed for the first time since anti-government demonstrations began on Tuesday. Some protesters seemed to welcome military vehicles driving through the city, as they'd hoped that the army would support their attempts to unseat President Mubarak. So far, there's been little sign of that happening. Earlier in the day, thousands came out to demonstrate after Friday prayers. Skirmishes between police and protesters left hundreds injured and several dead. Not all of the police wore uniforms. These pictures show a protester being confronted by plainclothes officers. The protests also spread across the country to Alexandria and Suez. Meanwhile, the head of the Wafd opposition party called for President Mubarak to step down. Another opposition figurehead, Mohammed al-Baradei, took part in Friday's demonstrations, but was later placed under house arrest.
The Egyptian people will take care of themselves. The Egyptian people will be the ones who will make the change. We are not waiting for help or assistance from the outside world, but what I expect from the outside world is to practice what to preach, is to defend the right of the Egyptian for their universal values: freedom, dignity, social justice.
Egypt is now starting to resemble a country under siege. Internet access was cut in the early hours of Friday in what's thought to be one of the largest shutdowns of its kind. Later in the day, mobile phone operators were told to close down their networks. Then on Friday evening, the state carrier said it was suspending all flights out of the country for at least 12 hours, while several international carriers reported their services would be disrupted. One man who's been conspicuous by his absence amongst all this has been President Hosni Mubarak.
Earlier I spoke to George Joffe, an expert on Egypt from Cambridge University, and asked him what he thought were the reasons for President Mubarak failing to yet address the Egyptian public.
It may be due to relations between Washington and Cairo, but I think it's probably much more due to the fact that the Egyptian authorities have suddenly discovered that the demonstrations today were not just simply the middle class and university students, but they began to involve the underlay of Egyptian society, those vast masses of impoverished people who up until now have stood aside from the demonstrations. And that must be an extremely worrying development for them. And not just that, in Suez, for example, the demonstrators actually overran the police and the army had to be brought in there. And that's a new introduction. That does change the picture considerably. So I think President Mubarak is probably thinking now, what would be the best way forward? Must he make concessions, or would he have to use a really hard line?
Now, opposition leader Mohammed al-Baradei reportedly has been under house arrest. I mean, there's been some reports he's actually now been released. But what impact will that have on the protest movement?
Well, I'm quite certain as far as the middle-class element of it is concerned, where he is in fact the symbol of resistance to the Mubarak regime, the idea of his house arrest and even his subsequent release will play very badly indeed. They will see this as a recognition by the regime that he is a genuine contestant for presidential power, even though he doesn't have a political party to put his name forward, and that will worry them extremely, very much indeed. So I think, in fact, his role could now become much more significant than it's appeared to be to date.
World leaders are expressing mounting fears over the situation in Egypt, calling for restraint on all sides and urging Egyptian leaders to heed the cries for reform. US officials have been reported as saying Washington may review its policy of providing huge military aid to Egypt in light of the Cairo government's response to those protests. Egypt is one of the top recipients of US aid, receiving more than €1 billion alone in order to fund its military. Let's take a listen to what US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had to say earlier.
We are deeply concerned about the use of violence by Egyptian police and security forces against protesters. We urge the Egyptian authorities to allow peaceful protests and to reverse the unprecedented steps it has taken to cut off communications. We strongly believe that the Egyptian government needs to engage immediately with the Egyptian people in implementing needed economic, political, and social reforms.
These protests are the biggest threat to President Mubarak, who's been in power for 31 years. The question's now been asked is whether he can ride the crisis out and how much can he firmly rely on the army to back him. Here's a look at the workings of the Mubarak regime and how the strongman has managed to quell opposition.
It was at a military parade that President Anwar Sadat was killed in 1981. In the blue jacket being led away is Hosni Mubarak, then vice president, who took over the presidency. Now nearing his 30th anniversary in the role, Mubarak has allowed little opposition. Elections have taken place, and there have been varying levels of tolerance for opposition groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood. But there's never been any real doubt as to who will run the country. In recent years, Mubarak has come to be seen as a key ally by Western governments in the face of Islamic extremism. Egypt is also one of only a few Arab governments to maintain diplomatic relations with Israel. It's with international support and the backing of the army that Mubarak has stayed in power.
The army, which is closely integrated into the system, has an economic interest in the survival of the regime. It can support President Mubarak up to a point, but it won't sacrifice itself for him.
One of the main threats to stability has been Islamic militancy. Events such as the 1997 attacks on tourists at Luxor were used as opportunities to crack down on Islamists across the political spectrum. However, there's been little recognition that extremism can be fostered by poverty in a country where about a fifth of the population lives on close to €1 a day. Mubarak is yet to confirm if he'll be running in September's presidential elections. Eyes are already turning to his son Gamal. But events on the streets may yet outpace any ideas of a new Egyptian dynasty.
And staying in the region, clashes have once more broken out in the Tunisian capital between riot police and hundreds of protesters.